want to welcome everybody. This is the first actual podcast from, we're going to call it KMSS, from MSS Business Transformation Institute. I just want to start a little bit off by talking about what the Transformation Institute is. The whole idea of the Business Transformation Institute is to provide knowledge platforms for companies, mid-size and up, to be able to do their own transformation. And so we do that through workshops, we do that through forums, we do it through podcasts. So this is going to be the first official podcast, and it's going to be a great one because we're going to be talking about a topic that I know absolutely nothing about, which always makes me excited. I'm not always exciting, but I'm excited. And we have two fantastic guests. So let's talk about what we're going to do today. The forum is focused on supply chain, but as always, we're looking at it from a transformation point of view. So how is it changing a business or an industry? Specifically, we're considering what organizations can do to ensure that their supply chain is adaptable, it's able to absorb disruptive forces. We exist in volatile and uncertain times, and variabilities on organizations act both directly and indirectly on organizations and can have massive disruptive impacts. So what we want to get into and talk about today is how can a person who's leading in the supply chain for a business, and at the C-level too, how can they prepare and transform their organization to thrive in the environment? Our guests today, we have two great guests. We have both friends, one an old friend and one a brand new friend. Dr. Greg Grundy heads the Public Sector Solution Department at LLamasoft. I love the name of that company. You're going to have to explain that. Overseeing projects in the military, government, and global health spheres. He joined LLamasoft in 2008 after working at Northrop Grumman and has worked for the past 14 years as a senior analyst for the United States Transportation Command at Scott Air Force Base, a place that I grew up, hold close to my heart. He worked first under the Strategy, Policy, Programs, and Logistics Directorate, and there's a bunch of military jumbo here, and the most recently with the Joint Distribution Process Analyst Center. And I promise to edit out any military secrets he gives away. But I think most importantly is that Greg and I went to the same fraternity at the same school, which means we passed out on the same couches after drank from the same kegs at Washington University. Greg, you want to tell us any more about yourself?
Sure. So as David said, my name is Greg Grindey. I'm the VP of Public Sector Solutions at LLamasoft. LLamasoft is a supply chain technology company. We build software that models the end-to-end supply chain. We focused on the design aspect of supply chain. So if you think of the three disciplines of supply chain, as we think of it, is design, planning, and execution. Design is kind of the strategic look at what you want your supply chain to look like in the future. So, what do I think I wants to look like 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now? So you forecast what the future might look like and then try to make the best decisions. Planning is more in the now. I have something I have to move, I have to order, I have to do something in my supply chain. I have a supply chain, what am I going to do? What's the best decision to make right now given what I have? And then execution is making it happen. There's things that happen in the moment, weather and breakdowns and other stuff that happens. So how do you cope with that? LLamasoft's lived in the design space for most of its history. We're moving more into the planning space. We found that some of our solutions in the design space apply also in the planning space, so we're kind of moving in that direction, but we've always been in the design end of it. My group within LLamasoft is focused on public sector solutions. So I work primarily with the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, and foreign ministries of defense, as well as a segment of our company that focuses on public health supply chains, what we call our global impact team that works on essential medicine and other important medical supplies deliveries in the developing world. So sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, countries that have unique infrastructure challenges and can get these supplies to the ports, but they have a real challenge in get them out to the points of need. So we have a practice that works with the World Bank, with UNICEF, with USAID to figure out kind of how to do that. So I'm kind of blessed within LLamasoft to not be focused so much on the commercial side, more on the public side, so that helps with morale. We're not always chasing a buck, but
But how do you come up with a name like LLamasoft?
it's a good question. I think so the legend is less glamorous. It is probably just looking for something unique and, a night of drinking, hey, let's call it LLamasoft. But we do have two capital L's in the LLamasoft, and the thinking there's two types of llamas, and it's an homage to those two. One is the beast of burden who participates in supply chains in South America, the llama, but also the Dalai Lama and other lamas that are the embodiment of enlightenment.
I always confuse
So
those two.
that's
To me, they're interchangeable,
Interchangeable.
really. Yeah. So I didn't know that I was at school with somebody. So there are a lot of smart people at WashU. It's more now than there were when we were there, but I didn't know I was at school with somebody so smart. I would have paid a lot more attention to you, and I would have probably realized that you and I lived down the street from each other in Arizona for about 10, 15 years at least.
I've been
So
here 10 years, yeah. Moved from
And we
St.
didn't
Louis
know
about
it.
10 years ago.
Yeah, we didn't know it. Could have been having more fun.
Could have.
We also have with us Heather Tamelio, who's about to be the Senior Director of Planning and Procurement at Katera Construction, right? When I started the conversation with here, you were in another position. You were with Fender Guitars. So you've gone from guitars to hard hats.
That's right.
Yeah, so, but you are a APICS certified supply chain professional and an S&OP certified, what's S&OP?
Sales and operations planning.
All right, thank you. And a graduate of Arizona State University, a local girl. She has nearly 15 years progressively responsible supply chain experience across a number of organizations and industries. And throughout your supply chain career, Heather, you focused on development of meaningful metrics that drive organizational focus and action. So getting down to really how do we measure effectiveness on supply chains. Among these are inventory management, customer fill rates, focus accuracy. There's a lot of them. Additionally, you're an experienced leader in driving and development of the implementation and continuous improvement in sales and operation and planning processes. There's the S and OP. So tell me about your move from guitars to hard hats. What's going to be the difference there?
I think it's going to be a huge difference. One, in the sense that Fender is a 60-year-old brand that's been building, manufacturing, and distributing a product for decades. And Katera is really a new startup organization that's really looking to introduce a new process and product to the construction industry by way of kind of challenging the old ways of kind of subcontracting out or separating out each phase of the construction process and kind of owning that end to end. So from the design to the sourcing or production of the goods to be used in the build, and then the actual construction. So really the terms ERP or planning or S&OP for a construction company historically I will be speaking Greek. So they're really looking to kind of revolutionize that from a technology perspective and offering kind of the same tools that are used in a more typical kind of corporate or retail or manufacturing environment to this industry.
Yeah, so when we were talking before the show, an interesting question came out. How does one decide they want to be you don't grow up saying, oh, I want to be a supply chain professional. How do you get to this point?
Yeah, I think for, I'd say what I'll call more experienced professionals at this point, lots of it's by accident. Operations or supply chain wasn't, quote unquote, a thing a long time ago, but by way of needing to get things from here to there, people have kind of just ended up in these roles that now has a name as supply chain. In Fender, we had an annual summer internship program, so we would bring in, our intern candidates, and they all have focuses or major in supply chain management. ASU is now offering a pretty good program in that. So one of my first questions to them is always, you're 19 years old. How the heck did you know you wanted to go into supply chain? And it tends to fall in three categories. One is there's a professor at ASU that is looking to revolutionize the supply chain world, and everyone takes his class and then converts to supply chain major. But the other two categories I think are probably more common, which is one is they know someone, usually a parent or someone who's kind of landed in that role. It sounds interesting. You get to touch a lot of areas. These are the things they hear, keywords. It sounds interesting to them. And then the last third has really done their research, and they know that if you're looking on the internet for hot career trends or, majors that are going to have a lot of potential over the next decade, supply chain's definitely probably in the top 10 list of that in terms of earning potential and kind of career growth and progression. So it really is one of those fields I think is catching attention just from what it has to offer to the individuals.
And it's a chance to work, in a lot of cases, a chance to work globally too, because
Absolutely.
things
Yeah.
are coming from all over the world.
Anymore,
right?
I mean, it's almost impossible to have a supply chain that doesn't touch the globe. Yeah.
So it's romantic travel, and you get to stay in
If you
five-star
consider
hotels.
traveling to China romantic, yes, I suppose.
A lot of conference rooms, like all
Yes.
business travel.
Yeah.
Now, I'll mention we have in the room, we have a couple of our MSS consultants who work in supply chain. Neither one of them will be introduced, but they might ask some questions along the way. I invite that. But I want to start off with a question to you, Greg, and I'm going to phrase this the right way. So when we look at the major changes that impact an organization and the volatility of the market, there's a lot of things that can disrupt the supply chain. What have you had to deal with in the past? What are some of the things that that people have to really look out for? You and I talked about unpredictability and nature of the world. You have to deal with it on the military side a lot.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the disruptions that you guys have dealt with and people can think about when they're trying to make their organization more adaptive?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different categories, I guess, of ways that things can get messed up, either in the structure of a supply chain or in the execution of a plan. Something as simple as weather can be disruptive, whether that be a blizzard or a hurricane or something like that, all the way to a tsunami, or I guess that's not really weather, but tsunami is, earthquake is not. But some kind of natural disaster can really mess up a supply chain. I think the most well cited example of that is a tsunami in China or in Japan that happened a few years ago and knocking out auto parts suppliers, and really the pain was felt downstream, and supply chains in the Detroit area were shutting down their auto supply chains at the factory lines because they couldn't get critical parts.
Yeah.
They only had one option or maybe two options, but in the same geographic area, and both of them were messed up as a result of the disaster. So that really opened a lot of people's eyes to, hey, there's a lot of things that can happen, whether it be political unrest.
Because you can't anticipate a tsunami.
You can't anticipate much of anything. There's a lot of things that could happen. So, our company looks at it from a modeling perspective. We build models of supply chains from end to end. We have some techniques for identifying, risky things, like single sourcing is a big risky thing, right? You want to have multiple options for getting your raw materials, your components for finished goods. Looking at places where there could be political unrest, and if you have a supplier in a country where there tends to be problems, that's something you should think about. We our approach to it is a kind of a what-ifing and a look at, so some diagnostic tools for identifying and then doing some what-if analysis, like what if this happens, and try to have a plan on the shelf for things that could happen, while also having a model of what your supply chain looks like, so that if something does happen, you can quickly respond to that in the best way and get back on your feet as quickly as possible. Hopefully get there faster than your competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to have the technology solution to help you prepare for the what-if scenario, because to your point, I mean, it's highly unlikely that you can anticipate any of these major disruptive things. I mean, at Fender, earlier in this year, we had within, I'll say, a 3 to 4 month period, we had factory fire where the factory burned down, and then we had a labor strike in 2 different countries that affected like 4 different factories. And then we had an electrical fire at one of our plating companies. It was just this, we were joking that, the locust must be coming next, because it was just one disaster after the next. And so, yeah, it's having some of those scenario options, and definitely the dual sourcing is like, the quickest solution is pull it from here and hope that, the other supplier has the capacity. But I mean, you really, especially this year, it's been like, there's just no way that you could predict either the frequency or the speed or anything at which those are going to impact your supply chain.
Yeah, who could guess that combination could ever happen, right?
Yeah.
When you look at that, you say, we're looking at everything from a transformational point of view. How's an organizational change to be more adaptive? When you're looking at all these scenarios and all the potential things that can happen across, especially a global supply chain. Like you said, political unrest, there could be all this stuff. But how do you, as an organization, you run the what ifs, but how do you prepare for the idea that you don't know what's going to happen? How do you set yourself up? You can run all the scenarios you want, but if you're not organizationally prepared for that, does that affect how you change your processes in your organization? How do you prepare for that?
So we do have modeling solutions. We also have kind of a visibility platform. So looking at, your end-to-end supply chain, where are the connections? So you can drill into that and look for, vulnerabilities, be able to see where things are. If I have a problem in this plant, what does that affect? Does it affect these components? Does it affect, these raw materials? What's the downstream kind of effects? Where am I expecting I might have problems? So the visibility and understanding of what that impact could be is critical. As I say, we're on the technology side, so we're not in reactive mode.
But you've dealt with it, Heather, and
Yeah,
in a lot of the organizations you've been a part of, you've had to change the organization to be more adaptive.
Yeah, so I think to me, a lot of it comes back to an effective sales and operations planning process. I mean, the crux of that as a process is you're looking at kind of your demand outlook versus your supply, and you're calling out wherever you think you might have constraints. Now, constraints could come in the form of anything, right? It could come in the form of we see risk to this factory because we know their labor's been unreliable, or the government is changing the wages or whatever. So you can talk about it not from an immediate capacity or constraint concern, but from some future risk, and have your mitigation strategies in place as a part of those discussions, so that really when it comes down to it, you're just pulling the trigger on something that you've already discussed, and you're kind of trying to predict and prepare your scenarios, so that then it doesn't require a big, massive, okay, now we need to gather all of our information and see what the impact is. I feel like that should be part of kind of the conversations that you're having as you go through that monthly cycle. It helps to get a little bit more prepared.
And I'll say that, preparing for these kinds of things is not free. Building robustness into your supply chain is, not the lowest cost solution. You're paying as a hedge against, these problems. It's like insurance, You got to spend it. You never know if you're actually going to need it, but, when the time comes, it could really pay off for you. So if you're, the cheapest cost may be a single supplier, and he may be quite a bit cheaper than, the next viable option. But do you really want to put all your eggs in one basket is the question.
Yeah, and I think it depends on so many factors. I mean, looking at the guitar musical instrument industry, there are a lot of very niche products that literally only have one place in the world that can make them. And so you do put a lot of risk, and you have, generally you're carrying more safety stock and doing all these other things to help stave off any, potential impact from a disruption. But I think it's the musical instrument industry is unique in that sense. Most things have, bigger scale and more easily transferable between different manufacturing sites. But
We had a specific example of how the organizations and Fender, they were changing to become a more sustainable organization. That had a massive effect on their supply chain.
Yeah, so we have, there's a governing agency, a global governing agency called CITES that kind of mandates they mandate the process for certain different flora and fauna in terms of how they're sustained, and how you have to kind of track across all distribution points to assure that you can source it back to its point of harvest. The governing board has been in place for decades. I think it started in the 70s. But just at the end of 2016, they added a new species of wood to their kind of umbrella that was a rosewood. To put it simply, almost every guitar that almost every guitar manufacturer makes has rosewood in it. So it's highly disruptive to the music industry, also to furniture, but we'll let them talk to their own battles. But so really what we had to do in a very short amount of time was really broaden our ability to react to kind of this paper trail requirement. And the complications came from, although it's a global governing body, they don't dictate how each country complies with it. So each country develops its own kind of rules and requirements and import-export documentation. And so every point it touches is a different battle, a different understanding, a different kind of record-keeping system. And so really within 3 months, you're trying to get 40 countries to put the documentation in place, understand what all that means, and make sure that you're following, you're in compliance with this new requirement. So Prior to that, not really a big deal. We just didn't use the stuff that was in it, but obviously I think we had 2 months to figure it out. You can't go re-engineer every product you have in a 2-month period. And so we had quite a few hiccups. Although Fender did it quicker and better than most everyone else in the industry, it was still highly disruptive, especially as you looked at our Europe, Middle Eastern, Africa business. So anything that was in the EU was simple, but getting it into the Netherlands, which is where our DC was, or is, their DC is, out to any non-EU country is import. Every country requires an import document. Every country has to produce an export document. And so we had containers that were getting held up for months and months and months. At one point we had 14 containers that were in quarantine in the Netherlands trying to get retroactive permits
But
issued.
if you're a Fender guitar part, that's the place to be, is in the Netherlands. I was hanging out in Amsterdam,
Yeah.
hitting some joints
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
So.
It's a good place.
Yeah, so here's the organization. It wants to be compliant, wants to be more sustainable. So it's really disrupting itself, and then that has a massive impact across the business.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it was a 2-step approach. One was triage, if you will. It's like, okay, how do we deal with the issues we have right now, and how do we continue to distribute this product? And then the second phase was really re-engineering, going back to the suppliers, working with alternate woods, which, by the way, are not always lower cost. So you're adding cost into your product and into your supply chain that way. I mean, I don't even know that you could quantify the cost that we added in terms of process, people, paperwork, whatever. I don't even know that we could figure that out. But there's that cost, and then there's the cost of re-engineering all the product, and then there's the cost, in lots of cases, for just the new materials that we're using to try and get away from, having to follow all the roadwork requirements.
In your experience, does the maturity of the organization affect and how well it responds to these changes and disruptions? Do bigger companies respond better than smaller companies? Do companies that have been around longer, because Fender's been around for a while,
Yeah.
do companies that have been around longer respond better?
I think it could go both ways. I think in a lot of cases, the more experienced companies have more experience. So, they've been around the block a few times. They maybe can anticipate and know. But also, the bigger companies, there's a lot more layers of management. There's, an executive. There's executive presence. There's a board presence. And depending on kind of how far these decisions are perceived to need to go before they get approval, sometimes a smaller company or a newer company is quicker and more nimble, and they don't have as many layers. So it could be easier. I mean, I think it really depends.
So I got one of my MSS colleagues wants to follow up on that.
Great discussion on adaptability. I just want to kind of extrapolate a little bit on the conversation and talk about maybe how partners and suppliers can either help the overall end-to-end process, or in a mature or less mature organization to, increase that adaptability. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
I do. So we have I guess 5 levels of supply chain maturity model. So it kind of depends on, where you're starting your journey and where you want to be at the end of it, at the top of the mountain. At the bottom is very, little sophistication in supply chain, disjointed, different organizations within the company, as well as not really visibility across your suppliers and others who might participate. As that moves up the maturity model, there's a lot more integration within the organization itself. So not looking at just transportation, just inventory, just manufacturing, that a lot of companies did 10 years ago before supply chain really kind of took off. We're looking at the integrated supply chain. So building that information flow and coordination throughout the company, and it's extending now to sales and operations planning, so even extending it even further, but also bringing in suppliers and getting data directly from suppliers and integrating that information from your transportation suppliers, your manufacturing raw materials suppliers, understanding what is going on inside of their supply chains as well. That's really kind of extending the bubble a little bit, and that's kind of their nirvana, when you can see much more of the situation than just your little piece of it.
Is that transparency readily available? Do partners usually say, yeah, come on in, check out all of our information and have a good time?
Well, there's only what you need to know. So certainly providers are, have their own business to run, but where it applies to you, I mean, that's a competitive advantage for you and for them to continue working with you. So you'll have, large companies will sometimes strong arm their suppliers to make sure that they're coordinating those kinds of things. If you have the Walmarts of the world who can kind of force what they want on their suppliers, it's absolutely part of it.
Yeah, I mean, for a large-scale consumer product goods company, yes, you probably can work pretty closely because you're dealing with, Walmart's, Target, Costco, whatever, and they have pretty robust systems and abilities, and they have a predefined set of, hey, here's what we're willing to share with you, and it's usually, the right information and information enough to kind of keep you going.
And here's the information I want from you.
Correct, and so then it becomes a collaboration, right? Here's what I'll give you, and here's what you give me, and we kind of do that together, and you get into vendor managed inventory and things like that, which, yes, allow you to be more responsive and more adaptive. However, to use Fender as another example, the vast majority of their number of customers is, it's like mom and pop music shops. You know what I mean? If you want to ask them for their inventory, they're like, okay, well, here's a piece of paper. Let's get a pen. We'll walk around and we'll write it down together. So that doesn't give a lot of ability to respond.
Just want to go back to a little bit on some of the regulatory issues. And I know many companies, like the Walmarts, are driving changes in their supply chain for the benefit of all consumers everywhere. But we're also seeing it at a governmental level. Producers and manufacturers having to go back and ensure and assure that no human rights have been violated in the production of any element or component of any products that they're manufacturing. And that puts a great burden on these organizations. Can you talk a little bit about how you are mitigating some of those risks in the supply chain and some of the overall costs that come as a result of those?
Well, from my point of view, that one's a tough one. That's one, so like I say, we're on the technology side, so compliance isn't necessarily our problem. I think, it adds, those kind of regulatory burdens definitely add a cost into the supply chain, and, she was
Yeah.
just talking about it a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean, a robust supplier qualification, vendor qualification process helps to mitigate some of that risk, but that definitely comes at a cost, and I think for Fender is probably where we had the best example. We had customers, I won't name them, but we had customers who had factory audits that they insisted on doing to kind of make sure that from their perspective, as their vendor, we have a risk, but once they take ownership of those goods, then that risk is transferred to them. So they want to go back, yes, we trust you, but we also want to see the factory that's building this stuff. So they had their own kind of vendor audit to make sure that it was a lot of things, safety, human rights, kind of all those things, and we actually had to turn factories down because they didn't meet the standards. So I think a little bit of it is just the sophistication of the organization and the sophistication of the customers that are receiving the goods probably drive a lot of those requirements. But as a manufacturer, we had some processes in place in terms of, like I said, the vendor qualification and kind of our PO agreement contract that kind of dictated the terms.
Okay, you said a couple times you work on the technology side on all levels of it. One of the things we run across in our business is people look at technology as a silver bullet to solve all their problems. Where is it best applied, and where have companies failed to utilize it in the best way?
Well, it's certainly not a silver bullet, but it is a bullet in the chamber, right? Companies have a wide variety of different problems, so the appropriate technological response depends on what the problem is. So we look at, as I mentioned, my group has an emerging world supply chain kind of practice looking at essential meds. Those countries have vastly different problems than a modern, a Target or a Pepsi Cola. But it's strange because Pepsi Cola operates and beer distributors and other large global manufacturers operate in those same countries and are able to get their product out to the people, where the essential medicines have real challenges getting it there. So there is expertise out there in solving these problems. It's people who have experience and they figure these things out. We look at technology as a way to augment that and bring it more to people who may not have, that level of supply chain sophistication. People in the ministries of health can design truck routes using technology. They can decide where to put distribution centers. decide how many trucks do they need to get these medicines out, to be able to look at drone delivery, for instance, something that's becoming more and more prevalent in Africa as a disruptive technology. Maybe it'll make it here, but in Africa, where you have these immense logistics challenges, just from an infrastructure point of view, drones can just fly over those kinds of things and deliver, blood or, antivenom or bring test results back to a clinic for testing. That really opens some new doors. So I think technology has its place, whether it's modeling technology or technology like UAV, but it needs to be, judiciously applied.
I have this picture of drones running into each other all over the world. If you hear any conference you're in, everybody's talking about drones. I was doing a brainstorming for a company a couple weeks ago, and one of the in each of the categories, everybody kept listing drones as I'm just picturing the sky where they're all bumping into each other and dropping things out of the sky. Are drones going to actually? I can see in Africa, right? But are drones going to be as prevalent? Somebody said in 2030, drones are going to be normal. We're going to be seeing them flying all over the place like swarms of bees.
Certainly entirely possible. I don't think it'll get to that level anytime soon. And like you say, I worry about them crashing into each other, falling on people, going out of control. Those are real problems, and those drones could hurt people. I don't see them being super prevalent, but there's certainly a lot of research. The Amazons of the world are looking at, how can I deliver things automatically? It holds great promise. There may be some restrictions on how that is. I don't see them flying around everywhere kind of willy-nilly. In Africa, it's a different problem.
Knocking
There
on
just
your
isn't
window.
that- yeah.
You're on the 50th floor. They're knocking on your window.
Well, put a box on the top, a delivery box on the top,
Yeah, yeah.
and they drop it in, and, you just
Kinda
go up to the top.
The whole idea
think
kind of
that-
scares me.
I think I think the FAA just enacted some new regulations around drones. I think just this week I heard any drone that weighs over 5 pounds has to be registered and licensed.
Oh.
So I think that changes things a
there you
bit.
go.
Yeah.
It's going to be rules about everything.
Yes.
So.
There's certainly less restrictions in Africa, so, in that
There's fewer
area,
airports, there's
it
fewer
makes
airplanes, there's
sense.
fewer buildings.
Right, there isn't a lot of, there certainly isn't a crowded airspace. There's different kinds of challenges there than here with getting around. So I think it's a fantastic solution in Africa. I'm not as convinced that it's a solution, in a metropolitan area in the U.S.
Makes me think of that IBM commercial, the guy was saying that, where are all the flying cars? I was promised flying cars. I'm still waiting for that. All right, so I want to take a step back here. So we try and gear everything to say, from a leader's point of view, what can we do? So let's say I'm a C-level leader in a mid to large organization. What are my obligations when I'm looking at ensuring that I have a solid supply chain, that it's adaptive and responsive? What do you, as somebody who's managing that, need from me? Heather, I'm shooting this to you.
Okay.
What do you need from me to make sure that I have all that you need to succeed? Where have you worked with good leaders, and where have you had trouble? Not specifically, we're not going to name Joe
Yeah.
Smith or somebody as a bad labor, but what are the traits of somebody who's that you would report to who's giving you what you need as a supply chain manager?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest supportive characteristics from executive leadership perspective is really kind of the accountability piece, kind of across the organization, right? So setting kind of goals, directives, targets, and then holding the right people accountable and helping provide the tools that they need to deliver, right? So not just here's an unobtainable metric, I'm holding you accountable for it, but it's reasonable. Tell me what you need to support it, and hold the person accountable for the results. And I think one of the best kind of stories I have from my career in terms of executive leadership, kind of setting the tone and giving the leeway for people to be successful, was a sales and operations planning kind of reboot overhaul that we did. So as I said before, sales and operations planning at its core is look at your customer demand, look at your supply, find out where they overlap, where we have misses, either positive or negative, and what are we going to do to resolve that. It's pretty basic in concept, much more difficult to apply just considering all the different people. It really is incredibly cross-functional, and in the prior kind of version of what we were doing, we would joke that it was M&OP because we didn't really have sales presence, but we had product marketing team. So it's like, okay, well, how are we getting forecast information if there's no salespeople present? How are we talking about inventory if we don't really have any consensus on this demand side? And nobody was really bought in. I mean, sales obviously wasn't bought in because they didn't even participate. The executive leadership team kind of didn't care one way or the other. They didn't really see the value in it. And so we got new leadership coming in and some new board representation and really set that kind of tone from the top is, hey, this is how we need to run our business. This is how we need to view and grow and adapt our supply chain. If we don't get these core principles figured out, then it's never going to happen. And so they kind of came in, gave this directive, put all the metrics in place. They were the same for everyone, kind of across the whole organization. So that kind of consistency, accountability, and something that's trackable, and said, here, sales is going to own the forecast, the regions are going to own the inventory, the planning and sourcing team are going to own the supply, the execution piece of that. And now everybody needs to work to figure out how we can rebuild this in a way that's actually functional. And I think having that kind of tone and support, and it really became a project from that perspective, where it was like, hey, this is something that's important to the business. And it was a pretty amazing transformation in that sense once everybody's working towards the same goal. So I think that, to me, is probably the biggest success story. On the flip side, I'd say,
I was going to say, how do I make sure that I'm well, reverse the problem. How do I make sure I'm a terrible executive for you have to deal with?
from a supply chain perspective, I think the worst is we have a leader who shall remain nameless in my past, and his approach to supply chain was, we need to have a full shopping cart. Anyone should be able to buy anything, anytime, any day, and we need to have all of it in stock all the time, which is a real surefire way to make sure you have way too much inventory. And so that kind of just blinders view of this is the one thing we're focusing on, without kind of recognizing that it really is a chain, and it has impacts all the way across the whole organization, from finance to the customer. And when you're trying to push that forward and you're trying to have everything all the time, then you have quality issues, you have manufacturing issues. I mean, it kind of just proliferates the issues across the board.
You think in that case, taking that person's perspective, I'm trying to look at my customer experience. I'm trying to make it so that I have everything available to them. So I can see where that thinking is coming from. I want to be responsive to the customer, and give them the best experience possible, but it's driving implications all the way throughout the organization. When I'm trying to create a customer-centric experience, how does that best translate into a good supply chain?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think it really boils down to all SKUs, all materials are not created equal. There are things that are super important that we need to have available all the time. They're the highest runner, or they're the highest value, or they're a proprietary SKU for a specific customer or something like that, where if you don't have that, then you're going to seriously impact your revenue stream. You're going to do all these things. But does everything have that same importance? And I would counter no. I mean, if it's something that we sell once every 4 to 5 months and we can get it in 30 days, then we can take the customer order, promise them to deliver it in 30 days, and we deliver it in 30 days, and customer's happy. And granted, I'm not in sales. My husband will probably counter this because he is in sales. Is that
Sales guys promise everything, right?
Yeah, is that generally speaking, from the industries I've worked in, the customer is not necessarily about immediate gratification. They're about you meeting their expectation. So if you say, I have it in stock today, I'm going to ship it tomorrow, that's the expectation you set, and as long as you meet it, you're fine. If it's, hey, I don't have it in stock, I'm going to ship it in 2 weeks, and you ship it in 2 weeks, their expectation is met. Where it goes downhill is, I don't have it in stock, I'm going to ship it in 2 weeks, and I don't ship it for 2 months. Is just meet the expectation that you set, not necessarily that you need to have everything available.
Need
all the
instant
time.
gratification.
Yeah.
If I don't get something
Amazon.
2 days away from now, I get really disappointed in everybody,
Yeah.
I'm on the phone, what the heck?
Yeah.
Well, Heather mentioned supply chain segmentation, so looking at not all SKUs are created equal, and that's absolutely true. So you almost have to build different supply chains for different types of stuff.
That's where predictive analytics comes in.
Well,
right?
you have to look at, you have to look at what things cost to hold in inventory. You have to look at lead times. You have to look at, where things are coming from and what kind of transportation. Do you have to expedite things? Really, the design of that supply chain is different for, a commodity like, toilet paper than it is for a Fender guitar. Completely different kind of approach to how you want to supply. If you run out of some toilet paper, okay, I can live with that for, not as a consumer, because there's
I was
something I
thinking
can
actually the reverse.
I'm going to lose some sales, right? Good point. I'm going to lose some sales, but it's not going to kill me. But if I lose a sale of a high-end guitar, that's much more.
But I will
serious
wait
problem.
longer for a high-end guitar than I will for a
And I think
toilet.
Exactly.
that's the difference between industries, and that's probably what you're driving towards is, there are some things where if I go to the store and the one I usually buy isn't there, odds are if I need it, I'm just going to buy the other brand.
There's
or
a substitute,
whatever.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a substitute. But, and my first industry was kind of bath and kitchen hardware, and people are redesigning their bathroom, and, they want a certain look and they want to do this, and so they're more likely to, I'm going to go with this style and I'll wait for it. And maybe they'll change the finish if if you're out of stock on something, but generally speaking, they're in this kind of range of products. But with guitars, it's absolutely 100% certain that someone knows what they're shopping for.
Yeah, they want exactly
when they go to the
that,
store.
and they're willing to
Especially a
wait.
more experienced player, maybe like a beginner kind of entry level, not so much. But it's an amazing phenomenon that just
Always wanted the Eddie Van Halen,
the Wolfgang special.
yeah, exactly. I wanted that one.
Hey, going back to your leadership kind of question, and I have some experience on the military side, and I can. So one of the biggest strengths of the military is that they rotate officers throughout their career. They're in a position for 3 years or so, and then they move on. One of the biggest weaknesses with supply chain organizations within the military is that officers move on after 3 years. So right when they're starting to learn the business, get a firm footing, they move on, and somebody else comes in and kind of starts from scratch. Different officers react different ways to that. But at the very top, when you see leadership change on a regular basis, you can get this zigzagging kind of phenomenon where one commander's priorities are different from another commander's, and this ping-ponging back and forth can happen. You get institutional, groups that'll just kind of wait out a commander, if there's something that they don't like. So the institutional momentum is a real problem, and change management is tough. I've seen it many times. I work with the U.S. Transportation Command and other the Defense Logistics Agency. It's common across all sorts of commands, and with the logistics kind of business, I guess, continuity of how you're doing things and zigzagging back and forth is really counterproductive. Having the vision, see what's right, and then pass that on and get the buy-in, not only from the top, but all the way down to the action officer level is extremely important and difficult. And maintaining that momentum for change really is difficult.
Yeah, I think the buy-in is the key term, kind of regardless. But I mean that you're describing that situation in terms of the government and the military, but it stands in the private sector as well, and in the corporate environment. We've been joking over the past few years that it's like, oh, okay, we're going back to that metric. Okay, let's dust off that one and bring it back to the forefront. And we're going to do it this way, and back and forth. So I think that is it echoes across multiple industries. And I would actually add, as you were saying that, going back to kind of the leadership question, I think one of the things I would add in terms of kind of that, what defines a strong leader, what can they offer to the organization to help, is to, from a change management perspective, say, okay, we're going to do this, and then give it long enough to see if it sticks. Because I think one of the things I've experienced in my career is, okay, we're going to do this, and then we do it for 3 months. Oh, and okay, let's go do this, and so you don't really have the case study time frame to be able to see was it effective or what parts of it were versus what it wasn't. So I think that there's a balance between failing fast and falling forward, and giving things enough time to see if it's actually generating the results that you want.
So then, I like the fact that you talk about change management, and I like the fact that we're talking about this experimentation thing, because when I look at especially complex organizations, one of the things is to experiment, see how something works. So start on a smaller scale,
Yeah.
make sure that it works. Once it works, then make it a little bit bigger, see how it works on that scale, and then kind of scale it up. Is that applicable in theory to supply chain?
Absolutely, yeah.
You get people who have been doing the same thing for 20 years and say, why do we need to change? It's always worked. They don't see the value to the bigger business of, making a change in technology or a change in process. It means them having to change. They don't like that. being able to communicate why you're doing that and then really show them benefits to
Buy-in.
to them, hopefully, but also to the larger organization, and get that buy-in is key to any sort of transformation.
I mean, in my experience, any person that you're trying to involve in whatever change it is you're trying to execute needs to understand and appreciate what's in it for them,
Yep.
right? If they don't understand and appreciate that from really the ground up, your odds.
And that they're key to
Yeah.
the success. If they're not going to follow through,
Yeah.
then, the whole thing's not going to work.
All my MSS consultants should be nodding because we just did a whole thing on change management, and we use the ProSci model of ADKAR, which starts with awareness and making sure people understand at an individual level how they do that. But
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations don't really follow through on that, or just kind of assume it away, and that's a dangerous thing.
it's most dangerous when they say, okay, well, we can handle that ourselves.
Right,
And then they get
right.
all the way down the path, and then people aren't adopting and people aren't changing. I'm going to get on a soapbox, but I want to flip something here because I want to make sure we get your experience, recent experience, when you wrote an article about that we also distributed through BTI to Greg is, when you look at the military and some of the things that you've had to deal with, you're talking about extreme complexity, extreme unpredictability. How you had a particular situation in Afghanistan and dealing with that, dealing with the VUCA nature of that volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous nature. What can tell us a little bit about that, but also what can organizations that are not military, but what can they learn from those experiences? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I recently wrote this article, or it's really a blog post at our, blog at LLamasoft. But it's a case study from, 5 to 7 years ago when we were actively in Afghanistan. And really before that, laying the groundwork for transforming the supply chain. Kind of set stage. Afghanistan, as most people may notice, is a landlocked country, so there are no large ports in Afghanistan. So you can't deliver things by ship directly. And
You could take a drone and drop a ship.
a lot of drones.
Yeah.
You talk about a swarm. When the U.S. military goes to war, in general, 80 to 90% of the stuff we send from the United States or from Europe or from wherever our depots are goes by ship. So it gets on a ship, and then either it gets on a train or it gets on a truck or some other, or another plane even, to get that last mile. But most of the material is just too big and unwieldy to use on planes. It's just way too expensive. So when you look at Afghanistan, when we first started the Operation Enduring Freedom, we were sending everything through Pakistan. So there's a port of Karachi, and we would send ships there. There were 2 landlines, trucks going up to the border with Afghanistan, crossing over, and then driving around the ring road to wherever their destination was. The problem there is that that's a single point of failure. It's not a supplier, but it is a land route that could easily be denied if Pakistan just changed their mind. And there was a point where politically there was some changing of the regime, I guess, in Pakistan to a less pro-American stance, and there was real valid worries about what that could impact the troops that were on the ground in Afghanistan. So the U.S. Transportation Command, where I work quite a bit, in concert with political advisors and the State Department and the Combatant Command, who's actually prosecuting the war, and a whole host of other people, got together and figured out, well, we need to find another solution, and the result was a land route called the Northern Distribution Network, and ultimately multiple land routes by train, by ferry, by truck, leading from Europe, for the most part, across across Russia and down through the stands to northern border crossings into Afghanistan. So a land route now, a secondary route in which was, as I said, costs more to do that. It's a longer way to go. There was more customs to deal with, some buying of local goods that was part of the deal to incentivize these countries to do it. So it was quite a bit more expensive to flow goods on that route rather than up through Pakistan. But the payoff came when I forget the year exactly, it's in the blog post, but there was a closure of the PAC GLOC, the Pakistan Ground Line of Communication, as we call it, after an incident where some Pakistani soldiers were accidentally killed by U.S. troops near the border. It was an accident, but the Pakistan government decided to deny access to the U.S. government, and I think that lasted about 6 months. So, if we had to fly all of our stuff into Afghanistan, the cost would be quite immense. So, while it cost more to open up that secondary route, in the long run, we ended up actually being better off for it. There was another time after that Pakistan also closed the PAC GLOC for a shorter amount of time, but the value of that insurance really was shown in that particular incident. I think companies can learn a lot from that. There's risk in putting all your eggs in one basket, as I said before. What's that cost worth to you? If you have a disruption and you only have one answer, how long do you expect that to be down? Do you have enough inventory in stock to wait it out? Or are you going to start losing sales like what happened, in Detroit after the tsunami? So, transforming takes courage, it takes foresight, it takes a lot of, follow through. If you have a board of directors that are only focused on the bottom line, you need to communicate that there's more. The bottom line is sometimes a moving target. There's a risk aspect here as well, and if you don't understand that risk and prepare for that risk, you're setting yourself up for trouble.
What I like about that is you had a number of variabilities that could have impacted you, and you came up with a solution that would account for multiple variabilities. And my guess is that you probably did an analysis, said, okay, this is a high threat, high impact potential, and then you probably have a different analysis that says, okay, here's something that's kind of low threat, low impact, but
Yep.
Sort of a risk matrix in that sense, right?
Yeah, so, well, in this particular case, it was pretty straightforward what could happen. There'd be a whole bunch of deployed troops with, little access to resupply. But, when we've done risk analyses in the past, it's looked at a whole range of things, weather, political things, structural changes, and then it's a ranking of likelihood and a ranking of impact, and kind of identifying those things that bubble up to the top is, here's my number one things I need to worry about, and start dealing with them first, and then kind of going down the list and deciding, all right, I'm at a point where I don't think the trade-off of mitigating that is worth, implementing. So now maybe I just think about what's my plan if something happens here, and be able to respond to it. And then there's other things that kind of bubble down, and you say, well, I'm not going to worry at all about those things. If they happen, I'll deal with them, at the time. I don't know if Heather has more experience with.
I think from my experience, the easiest and best kind of one is just a manufacturing version of the same thing you're saying, which is we know that this factory has issues, we know that it has risk. There's these three things that could go wrong. So let's start the process of either resourcing or dual sourcing now, so that if and when something happens, we're ready for that. And again, to your point, not always a lower cost solution, but
Usually not, yeah.
When push comes to shove, and you're ready to pull the trigger, and you have that alternative. And I think that's really what it boils down to, is how do you get ahead of it instead of waiting for it to happen.
Well, and you look at what the impact could be. So,
yeah.
hey, at least I've looked at it, right? And I know that if this happens, can I react with what I already have, or do I need to take measures to fix that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quote unquote luxury we have from a manufacturing perspective, from a manufacturer's perspective rather, is we're the customer, right, in a lot of cases. So we also can push back on the supplier to help them own up to some of that risk mitigation. So if they're the ones introducing the risk into the scenario, then how much are they liable for, and how can they help resolve it, rather than, in your scenario, it's like, well, it's kind of really all on.
Right, the
all
buck
on-
stops here, yeah.
So I think it's a little bit.
Okay, so we're getting close to time, but I wanted to throw something out at you. This is just one of those what-if type things. Start with Heather. So let's pretend you're just starting at a new company.
Let's pretend.
Let's pretend that. And you're walking in, you're going to take a look at the supply chain, you're going to look at what changes need to be. How do you approach that? How do you step in and approach it and look at the new situation, the new organization, and say, this is what you need to do?
Perfect time to be asking me this question. So I think for me, the first thing is to kind of understand what's being done now, right? Because I don't feel like you can start recommending changes until you kind of understand the full scope of the processes and the transactions and the people that are involved. And I generally approach things from two mindsets. One, what are the quick wins? So what's the stuff that's maybe not the most disruptive or impactful, but super easy to fix? Let's do that stuff first, because I feel like just from a team and a leadership perspective, it gives people that kind of motivation and momentum to keep going and tackle some of the stuff that might be tougher, more impactful, but a little more difficult to change. But in terms of kind of areas, I think from a pure planning perspective, and that's my background, really the flow is, demand, inventory, supply, and it kind of literally flows that way. So kind of looking at that demand forecasting piece and get that piece lined up as like the first order of business, the biggest thing. And in a lot of ways, it's the hardest one, because other stuff just kind of flows from that. And so first is quick wins, low hanging fruit, what we can do to just build that kind of win mentality. And then the second phase is, okay, how do we fix this? If it needs to be fixed, maybe it doesn't, but let's look at the demand forecasting piece, make sure that that's solid, and then kind of move into, all right, how do we manage the inventory, and then, or how do we manage the supply base, and then how do we manage our inventory? So it's pretty specific planning scenario, but that's the world I live in.
To know, if you're jumping.
Was that the interview question they asked you? When
No, I did have 8, so maybe they did. I just had time to perfect my answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you're jumping in, so you're jumping in from a different aspect, but I come to you and I say, I need a solution.
So we do have a consulting group within LLamasoft. I'm part of that group, but a different group goes in and looks at, what companies should do, what are the transformations that they need to be focusing on, because there's zillions of things that you could probably be looking at. The end-to-end supply chain is immense. So we look at it kind of in 3 dimensions of, what's the impact, how long is it going to take to do, figure out what the answer is, and then how hard is it?
So pretty
Essentially
much,
what you're saying.
pretty much.
Yeah,
That's
so
it.
kind of putting that on a graph, an X and Y, and then a kind of a size of the dot, and then start, with the higher impact and lower effort kinds of things, and, low-hanging fruit, as she said, makes the most sense. And then, moving from project to project, there's always things that can move on there, but you only have so much time in your analytics center. You're running a business already. You only have so much you can spend on looking at these problems and trying to change things. So you got to keep your head down, keep your business going, but pick and choose your battles, win those battles, get the buy-in that this is a valuable, thing to do. Once you get that buy-in, say, oh, hey, this actually affects the bottom line. This makes the process better. It makes it faster. We get some customer results out of this. Show the value, and the next time you go back and ask for more, leeway in changing things, you'll have, more success.
Okay. So, anything to add? I'm looking at my consultants. Anything you want to add in terms of questions or thoughts that you've learned from this? Angela's got something for me.
Yeah, thank you very much. We went through the whole spectrum of just a supply chain. We talked about adaptability, leadership, how to be customer-centric, how to be responsive, and kind of wrapped up, I thought, in a really nice way is just, what do you do when you walk into an organization, and how do you assess where it's at, and then where do you want to go, and then how do you get there? So I appreciate your comments and feedback and information you provided. Thank you.
Thanks for that summary. I don't have to do a summary now, so that's good. All right. Thanks, Angela. So, with that summary, Greg, you were about anything?
No, I
in
was
there?
saying thank you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to thank both of you for coming in. I know we do this early in the morning, and you have to drive, and although it's, it's a cold winter Phoenix morning, we got down to almost 45 this morning when I got out the door, so it's brutal. It's rough this time of year. But I really appreciate the fact that you both came in. I like the different perspectives that you bring. We're going to do some stuff in the future on supply chain as well, in terms of more articles, more content on the BTI. We're going to be developing some workshops that we'll be giving through the MSS BTI, so shameless plug there. And I hope you guys will continue to be involved with us. So Heather, good luck in your new
Thank you.
your new role.
Good luck.
And Greg, we got to go out and relive some fraternity nights.
Good old days, yes.
Yeah, I wish we actually didn't know each other that well then, but
Probably know each other better now.
probably better now. But it was it was the old days of wash shoes. So we're going to wrap up with that, and thanks everybody.
Thank
Thank you.